Picture this, it's May 1941 and you're trapped inside a German U-boat, alarms screaming, depth charges rattling your skull like a jackhammer. Water's rushing in, men are clawing toward the hatch in pure terror. You surface, gasping, expecting bullets, but instead, British sailors pull you from the freezing Atlantic and wrap you in warm blankets. Hot tea, kindness. And that's when it hits you. How did they know exactly where we were, every single time? These Germans were convinced the British had an unbeatable secret weapon. They had no idea the real answer was sitting right there in their own submarine. The crew of U-110 wasn't just fighting the British Navy, they were fighting against something they couldn't see, couldn't touch, and couldn't understand. Every time they dove, every time they surfaced, it felt like the enemy was reading their minds. And here's what made it so terrifying. It wasn't just one incident. It was pattern after pattern after pattern. They'd set up an ambush position, and somehow British destroyers would be waiting right there. They'd calculate the perfect intercept course for a convoy, and the convoy would change direction hours before they arrived. It was like playing poker against someone who could see your cards. But here's the thing, they blamed it on the wrong technology entirely. During interrogations after their capture, these German sailors kept talking about one thing, over and over: Britain's infallible detecting instrument. Senior officers swore they'd never sail again because this British device was just too good. One petty officer said the detection system was so advanced. It was like the British could see through the ocean itself. They'd analysed every attack, every pattern, and came to the same conclusion. There was no escaping this detection net. The Germans had their own intelligence officers trying to figure it out. They ran tests, they changed tactics. They assumed the British had some kind of revolutionary underwater detection system that was generations ahead of German technology. And in their minds, that made perfect sense. Britain was an island nation that had spent centuries mastering naval warfare. Of course, they'd developed the best submarine detection in the world. And yet, something about their confidence should make you wonder. Were they looking in the right place? See, the Germans weren't entirely wrong. The British did have ASDIC, which we call sonar today. And they were developing radar systems that could spot a surface sub in the dark. ASDIC worked by sending sound waves through the water and listening for the echo when they bounced off a submarine's hull. It was revolutionary technology for its time, and it genuinely scared U-boat crews. Radar was even more impressive. It could detect a submarine's conning tower in complete darkness or heavy fog, which meant surfacing at night was no longer safe. These weren't secret weapons anymore by 1941. The Germans knew about them, they'd captured documents about them, they'd experienced them firsthand. But here's what's wild. Those technologies weren't nearly as perfect as the U-boat crews believed. ASDIC had massive blind spots. If a submarine went deep enough or stayed perfectly still, ASDIC couldn't find it. If there were temperature layers in the water, the sound waves would bounce wrong. Radar in 1941 was still patchy, unreliable in bad weather, and couldn't see beneath the surface at all. A smart U-boat commander could evade both systems if he knew what he was doing. So that raises the obvious question. If ASDIC and radar weren't that good yet, how are the British so accurate? How did they know not just where U-boats were, but where they were going to be? The real reason the British knew where U-110 was going, what routes they'd take, what convoys they'd target, that was something else entirely. Something the Germans would never, ever suspect. Because the answer wasn't in British technology, it was in their own. The British weren't just detecting submarines, they were reading Germany's mail, and the Germans were the ones who'd handed them the mailbox key. But before we get to what the British actually had, you need to understand what was happening inside that submarine in those final moments. Because what these men experienced changed everything. Not just for them, but for the entire war. And it started with a commander who'd already made his mark on history in the worst possible way. Captain Lieutenant Fritz Julius Lemp was one of Germany's most experienced U-boat commanders. He'd already sunk the passenger liner Athenia back in 1939, an incident that made headlines worldwide. That sinking happened just hours after Britain declared war on Germany, and Lemp claimed he thought it was an armed merchant cruiser. The problem was, Athenia was full of civilians, including American citizens. Over 100 people died. It was an international incident that nearly brought the United States into the war years earlier than it did. The German government denied responsibility, called it British propaganda. But Lemp knew what he'd done. He carried that weight with him. By May 1941, he was hunting British convoy OB-318 in the North Atlantic, commanding a crew that ranged from seasoned officers to terrified teenagers who'd barely finished training. Some of these kids had been in the Navy for less than 6 months. They'd gone from school desks to submarine bunks in the blink of an eye, and now they were in the most dangerous theatre of the entire war. And on that day, everything went catastrophically wrong in a way that would expose secrets neither side intended to reveal. The British destroyers found them. Not by luck, by something far more precise. HMS Bulldog and HMS Broadway, two British escort destroyers protecting the convoy, got a contact on their ASDIC. But here's what the Germans didn't know. The British already had a pretty good idea that U-boats were in that area. Not from ASDIC, not from radar, from intelligence they shouldn't have had. The destroyers moved into attack position and started dropping depth charges. If you've never heard what that's like, imagine being inside a sealed metal tube while someone drops bombs all around you. Each explosion creates a shockwave that travels through water faster and harder than through air. It hits the hull like a giant fist. Rivets pop, pipes burst, the lights go out. Men are thrown against equipment, bones break, eardrums rupture, depth charges started exploding all around the hull. Each blast like being inside a bell while someone beats it with a sledgehammer. Helmuth Ecker, a war correspondent aboard, later described the explosions as terrifying. Men were thrown against bulkheads, lights flickered out, seawater sprayed through cracked pipes. The crew panicked. These weren't hardened veterans. Most were inexperienced ratings who'd been drafted into service. Some had been tailors, some had been farmers, some had been university students. Now they were trapped underwater with death pressing in from all sides. They scrambled topside in complete chaos. You have to understand what that moment was like. The submarine was damaged, taking on water, and the only thought in anyone's mind was, get out, get out, get out. They didn't grab documents, they didn't destroy equipment, they just ran. In that moment, survival instinct took over every bit of training they'd ever received. But Lemp did something that still haunts historians today. Instead of abandoning ship immediately, Lemp stayed behind. He asked about a junior officer who was sick, made sure someone was helping him. Leadership in that moment, when everything was falling apart and he could have just saved himself, he stopped to check on his men. Then, as the sub was going down, Lemp likely tried to ensure all the secret materials went down with it. Standard procedure was to open the vents, flood the submarine, send everything to the bottom where the enemy could never reach it. He drowned trying to protect what was inside that submarine. His last words, according to survivors, were about the welfare of his crew. He never made it out. Meanwhile, his men were being pulled from the water by British sailors who treated them with unexpected gentleness. Warm clothes, hot drinks, genuine care. Imagine being in their position. You're expecting to be shot, or at best, roughly handled and thrown in a cell. Instead, these enemy sailors are wrapping you in blankets, handing you tea, asking if you're injured. It created this cognitive dissonance that broke down barriers the war had built. And while the Germans were being wrapped in blankets below deck, British boarding parties were quietly climbing into U-110. See, the submarine hadn't sunk. Lemp thought he'd flooded it properly, but the vents didn't fully open. U-110 was sitting there on the surface, abandoned, with everything inside intact. The British sailors who boarded it couldn't believe their luck. They were walking through a submarine that still had its lights on, equipment running, and most importantly, nothing destroyed. What they found inside would change naval warfare forever, but the German crew bobbing in those rescue boats had no idea. They thought their submarine was at the bottom of the Atlantic, taking all its secrets down with it. Now, you might think the story ends there. Sub captured, crew rescued, war goes on. But what happened during those interrogations revealed something nobody expected. Something about who these men really were, because war has this way of flattening people into categories. German sailors, British sailors, us versus them. But when you actually sit down with prisoners when they're no longer fighting for their lives, when they're warm and fed and safe for the first time in months, the truth gets a lot more complicated. Among the rescued crew was a senior petty officer who had navigation duties. Ordinary guy, right? Middle-aged, experienced sailor, probably joined the Navy years before the war started. Except during interrogation, when the conversations got personal, when the British interrogators created that atmosphere where prisoners felt comfortable talking, he started sharing stories that made everyone in the room go quiet, because this German sailor had survived something most people couldn't even imagine before he ever set foot on a U-boat. He'd been in a Nazi concentration camp. This man, now wearing a German naval uniform, serving in Hitler's military, had experienced the camps firsthand. And he talked about it, the cruelty, the brutality, the way human beings were treated like garbage by their own government. He described guards beating prisoners for entertainment, people dying of starvation and disease, while the world outside pretended nothing was happening. The constant terror of arbitrary executions. This wasn't propaganda or exaggeration. This was a man who'd been there, who'd somehow survived, and who'd then been forced into military service despite what the regime had done to him. Other crew members around him nodded. Some admitted they'd been forced into service. Some had communist leanings they'd hidden to avoid being arrested themselves. Others were just kids who got swept up in conscription and had no choice. One sailor had recently had surgery and was still recovering when he was assigned to U-110. Another had family members who disappeared into the Nazi system and never came back. The British interrogators realised something profound. This wasn't a crew of zealous Nazis ready to die for Hitler. These were men trapped in a system, many of whom hated it as much as their enemies did. Some were true believers, sure, but most were just trying to survive a nightmare they hadn't chosen. And that created this strange dynamic in the interrogation room. The British had expected to face hostile prisoners who'd refused to cooperate. Instead, they found men who were relieved to be out of the war, who were grateful they'd been rescued instead of left to drown, and who were willing to talk because they didn't have much loyalty to the regime that had put them there. But here's what makes this moment so important for understanding what the British discovered. See, when you're interrogating prisoners, you're trying to understand not just what they know, but who they are. The British were experts at this. They'd praise the prisoners' skill, show detailed knowledge of their careers to create this impression that resistance was pointless, create this sense that we already know everything, you might as well talk. They'd pull out files with accurate information about German naval operations, about specific U-boats and commanders, about tactics and procedures. And the German prisoners would sit there thinking, how do they know all this? The British must have spies everywhere. Their intelligence network must be incredible. It created this psychological pressure where cooperation seemed like the rational choice. And it worked. These men, grateful for being rescued, warming up with hot tea, treated with more humanity than they'd expected, started sharing things they never would have shared otherwise. They talked about the infallible British detection, about how hopeless it felt to be hunted by an enemy that always knew where you were, about how they believed Britain had technology that was years ahead of German engineering. They described the fear that came with each patrol, knowing that British destroyers would find them no matter how careful they were. Senior petty officers said they'd never go back to sea because the British detection system made submarine warfare a suicide mission. They analysed British tactics, praised British skill, and consistently attributed their capture to superior technology. It became this shared narrative among the crew: we were beaten by better equipment, not by our own failures. And while they were talking about detection devices and radar and sonar capabilities, nobody, not one single German sailor, suspected the British had something far more valuable than any detection device. Because while the crew was being questioned on the destroyer, back on U-110, British sailors were discovering something that would let them read Germany's mail for the rest of the war. And what they found was sitting in the radio room exactly where it was supposed to be, completely intact. Inside U-110, in the radio room, British boarding parties found an Enigma machine with all its codebooks intact. If you don't know what Enigma was, it was basically Germany's unbreakable encryption system. Every message, every order, every U-boat position was encoded through this machine. It looked like a typewriter connected to a plug board and a series of rotors. You'd type in your message in plain German, and the machine would scramble it into gibberish using a series of electrical pathways that changed with every keystroke. The person receiving the message would have their Enigma machine set up the same way, type in the gibberish, and get back the original message. The Germans believed it was mathematically impossible to crack because the number of possible rotor positions and plugboard settings was astronomical. Even if you captured an Enigma machine, you'd need to know exactly how it was configured on that specific day to read the messages. And they were right, unless you had the machine itself and the code books that told you how to set it up each day. The British already had code breakers at Bletchley Park working on Enigma. Brilliant mathematicians like Alan Turing had developed theoretical ways to break the code, building massive computing machines called bombs that could test thousands of rotor positions per minute. But without the daily settings and code books, it was like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. They could sometimes break individual messages after days or weeks of work, but by then, the intelligence was useless. A U-boat position from 3 weeks ago doesn't help you protect a convoy today. When they pulled that Enigma machine out of U-110, along with the code books that showed exactly how to configure it for the next several weeks, everything changed overnight. Suddenly, British intelligence could read German naval communications in real time. Not all of them, the German Army and Air Force used different settings, but naval communications which were the most critical for the Battle of the Atlantic. They knew where U-boats were hunting, what convoys they were targeting, when they'd surface to recharge batteries and send reports. It was like having a spy at every German naval headquarters, reading over their shoulder as they wrote orders. The intelligence was so good that British commanders could position escorts exactly where they were needed, reroute convoys around wolf-pack formations, and set ambushes for U-boats that thought they were the hunters. But here's the part that's almost hard to believe. The Germans never figured it out. After U-110 went down, well, after the Germans thought it went down, the German Navy launched investigations. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, who commanded the U-boat fleet, knew something was wrong. The British were too accurate, too prepared, too good at being in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. His staff analysed everything. They looked for spies. They interrogated returning crews about what they might have said to British interrogators. They changed communication procedures. They even considered whether Enigma might be compromised. But they blamed it on spies, on bad luck, on British detection technology getting better, on statistical probability. The idea that their unbreakable Enigma code was actually broken? Impossible. The mathematics didn't allow it. They'd consulted their own experts, who assured them that even with a captured machine, breaking Enigma would require decades of computation. What they didn't know was that the British had industrial-scale computing happening at Bletchley Park, with hundreds of people working in shifts around the clock, with machines specifically designed to crack their code. So they kept using it. And because the British were incredibly careful about how they used the intelligence, they'd send out search planes to discover U-boats they already knew were there. They'd vary their responses so it didn't look like they had perfect information. They'd sometimes let convoys get hit to avoid revealing that they knew where the U-boats were. The Germans never caught on. The British created this elaborate deception where they'd have a plane accidentally spot a U-boat in the exact area where ultra-intelligence said it would be. They'd act surprised, scramble destroyers, and make it look like normal naval operations. Sometimes they'd even let a convoy sail into danger if changing its route would be too suspicious, sacrificing ships and sailors to protect the larger secret. It was brutal calculus, but it worked. Meanwhile, that intelligence called Ultra saved hundreds of thousands of lives overall. Convoys were rerouted away from U-boat wolf packs. Destroyers were positioned exactly where they needed to be. Supply lines stayed open when they should have been cut. In 1942, at the height of the Battle of the Atlantic, U-boats were sinking over 500,000 tons of Allied shipping per month. Britain was genuinely in danger of being starved into surrender. But as ultra-intelligence improved and the codebreakers got better at reading Enigma quickly, the tide shifted. By 1943, the Allies were sinking U-boats faster than Germany could build them. The Battle of the Atlantic, which was slowly starving Britain, which was killing thousands of merchant sailors every month, which threatened to make an Allied invasion of Europe impossible, began to turn. And it all traced back to that moment when British sailors climbed into an abandoned German submarine and found an intact Enigma machine. But there's something else about this story that doesn't get talked about enough. Something about what happened between those British sailors and their German prisoners that shows you war's more complicated than we usually admit. Because the easy narrative is that Germans were the bad guys, British were the good guys, and that's the end of it. But the reality on the ground in those rescue boats and interrogation rooms was messier and more human than that. When those German sailors hit the deck of HMS Bulldog, soaking wet, exhausted, terrified, they expected the worst. This was war. They'd been trying to sink British ships for months, trying to cut off Britain's food supply, trying to starve an entire nation into submission. If the roles were reversed, if British sailors were being pulled from the water by Germans, treatment could range from decent to brutal, depending on who was in charge. These men had heard propaganda about British cruelty, about prisoners being tortured or executed, about the horrors that awaited anyone captured by the enemy. Every military tells those stories to its soldiers because it makes them fight harder rather than surrender. Instead, British sailors treated them like human beings, and that unexpected kindness created a moment that still matters today. The German crew later described the treatment as generous. They got dry clothes, warm food, medical attention if they needed it. British sailors shared cigarettes with them, made jokes to ease the tension, asked about their families back home. There's something about being pulled from freezing water by the men you were trying to kill just hours ago. It breaks down walls that propaganda and ideology had built. These British sailors had every reason to be angry. Some of them had lost friends to U-boat attacks. Some had been on ships that barely escaped torpedoes. Some had pulled bodies of merchant sailors from the Atlantic after U-boat attacks left them burning or drowning. But in that moment, they saw fellow sailors who needed help, and they helped them. During those interrogations, Germans would thank their captors for the rescue. They'd express genuine gratitude for the treatment they'd received, for being alive when they'd expected to die, for being warm and dry when they'd been sure they'd drown in the freezing Atlantic. They'd talk openly, not just about military matters, but about their lives, their doubts, their fears, about what was happening back home in Germany. That concentration camp survivor could share his story because he felt safe enough to do it, because he was in a room with people who treated him like a human being, rather than a number or a target. These weren't hardened propaganda moments. These were real conversations between men who realized they weren't so different. British sailors had families they missed. German sailors had families they missed. British sailors were tired of the war. German sailors were tired of the war. British sailors wanted to go home. German sailors wanted to go home. One German sailor talked about his fear that his wife back in Germany didn't know he was alive, that she'd get a telegram saying he was missing and presumed dead, and she'd spend months not knowing whether to mourn or hope. A British interrogator promised to make sure the Red Cross was notified so his family would know he was a prisoner and safe. That small kindness, that acknowledgement that yes, you're my enemy, but you're also a husband who loves his wife, created trust that made the interrogation more productive. But it also created something more valuable than intelligence. It created a moment where the war's machinery couldn't quite crush the humanity underneath. But the war didn't stop just because they'd found common ground. Later, when these same prisoners were moved to POW camps, some of the goodwill faded. Ecker, that war correspondent who'd been so grateful for his rescue, became resentful about conditions in the prison camp. The food wasn't as good, the guards were less friendly, the boredom and isolation wore him down. He vowed to write a book after the war about his indignities in British prison, about being treated like a criminal when he'd just been doing his job. Other prisoners grew bitter about being captive while the war raged on without them, about missing years of their lives sitting behind barbed wire, about the uncertainty of when or if they'd ever see home again. The initial gratitude gave way to the grinding reality of captivity. But that initial rescue moment, that brief window where enemies treated each other with dignity, it showed something important about what gets lost in war. These men on both sides weren't monsters. They were husbands, sons, brothers, caught in something bigger than themselves that they couldn't control. The British sailors who rescued them knew that. They'd seen enough war to know that the man drowning in front of you isn't really your enemy. He's just another poor bastard who got sent to fight a war he probably didn't start. The German sailors who were grateful knew that too. They'd been pulled from the sea by men who could have let them drown or shot them in the water, and instead got kindness. And in some small way, that moment of humanity mattered just as much as the Enigma machine that was being carefully dried off and catalogued below deck. Because here's what we lose when we turn history into simple stories of good versus evil. We lose the concentration camp survivor who somehow ended up serving in the German Navy, carrying trauma from his own government even as he fought for it. We lose Fritz Julius Lemp asking about a sick junior officer in his final moments, showing leadership and care even as his submarine was sinking. We lose the British sailor who handed a cigarette to a German prisoner because he saw someone who needed it. We lose the young German rating, barely 18 years old, who'd been a university student 6 months ago and was now just grateful to be alive. We lose the complexity of men who hated the regime they served but served it anyway because refusing meant death or imprisonment. We lose the interrogator who promised to contact the Red Cross for a prisoner's wife, not because it would get better intelligence, but because it was the right thing to do. And we lose the understanding that the biggest intelligence coup of World War II, the capture of the Enigma machine that helped win the Battle of the Atlantic, happened because a crew of exhausted, frightened men abandoned their submarine in a panic, and their captain drowned trying to destroy secrets that survived him. There was no dramatic last stand, no heroic sacrifice that failed nobly, just chaos and terror and mistakes that changed the course of history. The British didn't capture U-110 through brilliant tactical planning. They captured it because depth charges forced it to surface, and the crew panicked. The Enigma machine wasn't secured through espionage or commando raids. It was just sitting there in the radio room because nobody had time to destroy it properly. That's the reality of war. It's not chess matches between strategic geniuses. It's exhausted people making desperate decisions under impossible pressure, and sometimes those decisions echo through history in ways nobody intended. The Germans spent the rest of the war convinced that British detection technology was the reason they were losing, never suspecting that their own unbreakable code had been broken. They kept sending messages through Enigma, kept organising wolfpack attacks through Enigma, kept reporting their positions through Enigma, and the British kept reading every word. Dönitz would later say that if he'd known Enigma was compromised, he would have changed everything about U-boat operations. But he didn't know because the British deception was that good, and because the idea that Enigma could be broken was literally unthinkable to German naval command. Tens of thousands of sailors on both sides died in the Battle of the Atlantic. Merchant sailors burned alive when their ships were torpedoed. U-boat crews drowned when their submarines were sunk. Escort crews were killed when their destroyers were hit. The Atlantic became a graveyard that stretched from North America to Europe, filled with men who drowned in the dark while their families back home waited for letters that would never come. And somewhere in all that death and horror, there was U-110, sitting on the seafloor where it eventually sank after the British towed it as far as they could, taking Fritz Julius Lemp's body down with it, becoming another grave marker in an ocean full of them. But the Enigma machine made it to Bletchley Park, the code books made it to Bletchley Park, and the intelligence that came from them saved more lives than were lost on U-110. That's not meant to justify anything or make the deaths seem worthwhile. War isn't a math problem where you can calculate acceptable losses. But it is meant to show that history turns on these small moments that nobody planned. A crew that panicked instead of following procedure. A submarine that didn't sink when it was supposed to. A boarding party that found everything intact. An interrogation where prisoners felt safe enough to talk because they'd been treated with unexpected kindness. All of these tiny human moments added together changed the trajectory of the war. And maybe that's the real lesson here. We spend so much time studying the big decisions, the grand strategies, the movements of armies and fleets, that we forget wars are fought by individual people making individual choices. The British sailor who pulled a drowning German from the water made a choice. The German sailor who talked openly during interrogation because he'd been treated well made a choice. Fritz Julius Lemp, asking about a sick officer while his submarine was sinking, made a choice. None of them knew how those choices would ripple outward. None of them were thinking about how historians would analyse their actions 80 years later. They were just people trying to survive or help someone else survive, making the best decisions they could with the information they had. The German U-boat crews never understood how Britain knew their every move because the truth was too improbable to believe. Their unbreakable code was broken. Their perfect encryption system was being read in real time. Their most sensitive communications were being translated and analysed before the ink was dry on the transmission logs. And all of it happened because of a series of accidents and human reactions that nobody could have predicted. Not because the British were smarter or more ruthless or better at warfare, but because in one specific moment on one specific submarine, everything went wrong for the Germans in exactly the right way for the Allies. That concentration camp survivor who served on U-110 survived the war. Most of the crew survived the war in POW camps. Helmuth Ecker wrote his book. The young ratings went home to Germany and tried to rebuild lives in a country that had been destroyed. The British sailors who rescued them went on to fight more battles, escort more convoys, pull more drowning men from the sea. And somewhere in all of that, in the mess and chaos and unexpected moments of humanity, the war's outcome was decided by an Enigma machine sitting in an abandoned submarine, and the men who found it. What hidden war stories does your family carry? Drop them below. These human moments deserve to be remembered.